Again, welcome to North Shore and happy New Year's Eve to everybody who is here in this room and those of you who are joining us online. And by the way, for those of you who are just online because it's New Year's Eve, I'm just so sorry you missed the complimentary buffet that we're all enjoying here in the building today. But before I get into the message, I just want to make a quick reminder about what's coming next. Next week, we're kicking off a series called Breakthrough. And I don't know about you, but for me, so many of the seasons of my spiritual life have been defined by this idea of stuckness. Like I just feel stuck in my life with God, or stuck in a certain doubt, or stuck in a certain fear, or stuck in a certain circumstance. And part of what I have learned throughout my life and what I want to invite you to walk with me through is the power of God to intervene and literally break into those stuck places in a new way. And I believe he can do that and wants to do that in your life, whether it's a stuck place personally or relationally or emotionally or spiritually or financially, whatever it may be. And so we're going to be walking through this little book in the New Testament called Galatians. It's one of Paul's letters where it's really a radical picture of the power of God to break in and rescue people from whatever is holding them back. And so I just want to challenge you not just to come back next week, to be thinking about who is it you can invite, who is it in your life that needs sort of a fresh start or a word of encouragement or a word of challenge. So just be praying about that and thinking about that as we get into this new year. So some time ago, I read a story about a young man who was interviewing for a job, kind of his dream job for him. And he was a talented young guy, charismatic, super qualified for the role, so he kind of thought he was going to be a shoo-in for the job. But after about 10 minutes with the hiring manager said, I'm sorry, I just don't think you're the right fit for this role. And the young man said, wait, I don't understand. We've only been talking for a few minutes. We haven't even gone through my resume yet. And as you know, I'm qualified for the job. I meet all the criteria. If anyone deserves this job, it's me. And the hiring manager said, you are qualified, but I've noticed this entire time we've been talking, you've been on your phone just texting as we've been talking. True story. But that wasn't all of it. 2 hours later, after the guy went home and was kind of frustrated, didn't get the job, 2 hours later, the hiring manager got an angry phone call about the interview. Any guesses on who called? I heard everyone mumble the phrase. You know it, right? His mom called and said, how dare you reject my son? And can you believe it? And I had to tell her, Mom, you just can't keep calling people when I don't get the work. And I'm just kidding, it's not my story. It's a true story, but it didn't happen to me. But question, have you ever met someone, interacted with someone, encountered someone in your life who just went through life with kind of a spirit of entitlement? A belief that, somehow they deserve special treatment. They have this assumption that life owes them happiness or comfort or privilege or power. Why? Because they're special and they deserve it. And by the way, this kind of thinking isn't just stuff that happens out there. It's all over the place in church and in spiritual life today. I remember talking some time ago to a pastor at another church who said someone had sent in a request to be in a small group in the church. But their request had these very specific conditions upon which they would agree to be part of the small group. For example, they said everyone in the group should be between the ages of 35 and 40. They should be married with kids in elementary school, preferably private school, and they should make at least $100,000 a year, just to make sure the group works for me. That's a true story. And it might sound extreme in those terms, but have you not thought about, does this church work for me? Or does this group work for me? Or does this ministry work for me? Or does this message right now work for me? And some of you are thinking, I'm not sure it's working for me right now, right? Because we do the same thing. Because here's the real kicker when it comes to entitlement or the spirit of entitlement. It's really easy to see it in other people. Of course, how dare they? It's really hard to see it in ourselves. Why? Because if you think you deserve it, how could it possibly be entitlement? You deserve it, right? So why am I bringing all this up? Well, we've been kind of walking through this series in the month of December called Down to Earth. It's been all about the humility of Jesus and how he calls us to a life of humility. And we've been using this really helpful definition of humility by a guy named John Dixon, who said humility is the choice to forgo your status, deploy your resources, or use your influence for the good of others before yourself. That's the kind of humility that Jesus lived, and the kind of humility that he calls us to live. But here's the thing. In order to cultivate this kind of humility, we actually have to root out any kind of spirit of entitlement in our lives, because in a sense, people might say, well, the opposite of humility is pride, and that's true. But really, practically speaking, the opposite of humility is entitlement. It's this sense that somehow I stand above the rest. I deserve special treatment. The world should revolve around me. And here's how I know this is true. You can't be entitled and humble at the same time. So to finish this series and kind of get us launched into this new year, I want to walk through a particular story that Jesus once told that points to the solution to the spirit of entitlement that's so prevalent in our day. If you have a Bible or Bible app with you want to follow along there, you can open that up to Matthew. That's the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 25. And we'll get started in verse 14. And I'll just say this as you're kind of moving that way. This is a challenging story. And so if you're up for it, you're going to get a little challenge this morning. Anybody up for a little challenge? A little more? Yep, a few of you up. Some of you like, I've had enough challenge in 23. I just need a day off. Well, it's not today. You picked the wrong church. I apologize. But we're going to dive in. Jesus says he tells the following story. It's a parable. It's a story that he basically created to paint a picture or make a point about what it means to follow him in his kingdom. Jesus said this, "It will be like a man going on a journey who called his servants and entrusted his wealth to them." If you have a Bible with you, a paper Bible, you got a pen, you can flag that phrase. We'll come back to it. Entrusted his wealth to them. To one, he gave 5 bags of gold, to another 2 bags, and to another 1 bag, each according to his ability. Then he went on his journey. The man who had received 5 bags of gold went at once and put his money to work and gave 5 bags more. So also the one with 2 bags of gold gained 2 more. But the man who received 1 bag went off, dug a hole in the ground, and hid his master's money. Now I want to pause for just a moment, because this whole story begins with a staggering statement, a staggering picture or claim about God. The kingdom of heaven will be like a man, who in this case represents God, who goes on a journey, but before he leaves, he entrusts his wealth to his servants. He entrusted whose wealth? His wealth to them. Now, I just want to pause here and just point out the fact that if I was God's, financial advisor, which I am in no way qualified to be, but if that was my job, I would immediately say, this is a really bad idea. I mean, for you to entrust your wealth, your resources, what you can do, what you have the power to do to people like me and people like you, I mean, that cannot be wise. And by the way, these are no small amounts of money. Some versions of this story, if you have a Bible, some versions will use the word talent instead of bag of gold. It's just an expression for a certain amount of money. And just so you know, a talent was worth around 20 years of income for the average day laborer. 20 years. So, do the math. The 5-bag guy is getting 100 years of income. I mean, think about that if that was your Christmas bonus this year, like 100 years of income. The 2-bag guy gets 40 years of income. The 1 bag gets 20 years of income, which even though it sounds like a little in the story, that's a lot. He's been given a lot. And notice, the money is not given because the man owes the servants anything. He does not owe them a thing. It's given because the man trusts his servants, which tells us a lot about God, doesn't it? It tells us that God, regardless of what else you think about who God is or how you know him to be, that God is fundamentally good, he is fundamentally generous, and he fundamentally trusts us. I know, again, it's crazy to think God would trust us this much. And he longs for us to experience the joy of investing what he's entrusted to us in others so that we can experience having a life of more meaning and significance and joy. In other words, you are not entitled, you are entrusted. You are not entitled, you are entrusted with skills, abilities, wisdom, resources, time. But notice, he didn't entrust them evenly, did he? There was a guy who got 5, a guy who got 2, a guy who got 1. And some of you, if you're like me, when you read that, you're like, 3 words came to mind immediately in your head. That's not fair. Come on, God. You're supposed to be, fair, equitable. I mean, what are you doing giving 5, 2, and 1? Just doesn't seem fair. And of course, we all know this feeling, this sentiment. As most of you know, we have 2 kids at home, 6 and 3 years old, and who love opening presents on Christmas morning. I know some of you do your Christmas presents on Christmas Eve. We do Christmas morning, which is what the Bible teaches. It doesn't, but anyway. But our kids wake up excited and ready to see what's inside those neatly wrapped packages. The problem happens when one of them gets a different toy than the other. You parents, you know where this is going, right? It could be a much worse toy. It could be a cheaper toy. It could be a broken toy. It could be a toy that I found in the attic and just re-wrapped up because I forgot to buy them something for Christmas. It doesn't matter. Anytime one gets something the other doesn't, I hear those 3 dreaded words. That's not fair. Now, the reason I'm telling you that story, we can smile about it with kids who are 6 and 3, is that we actually don't ever grow out of this kind of thinking. We don't just naturally get to an age or a stage where we stop thinking this. In fact, I'm tempted to think this way all the time. When I see someone who has nicer stuff than I do, or who's a more talented speaker than I am, or who leads a larger church than I do, I'm just so tempted. My first thought inside, just to be honest, just to confess, that's not fair. But here's the thing. This kind of mentality or thinking isn't really about fairness. It's actually about entitlement. And here's how I know. It's because we only think it's unfair when someone else gets more, right? But if we get blessed, if we get more, we deserve it, right? Do you see? Think about it. How many times have you heard someone who got like a below market deal on their rent or a huge promotion at work say, I can't believe it, that's just so unfair? Never, right? 0 times has that happened, because I'm only going to complain that life was unfair if I get 1 bag of gold and I see that you get 5. But if I get 5, well, I worked hard. I'm a pretty special person. I deserve it. Because here's the thing, at the core of who we are, we're actually not really that concerned about fairness. There's a lot of things in the world that are deeply unjust and unfair, and that's not what I'm waking up concerned about. What I'm concerned about is, am I getting what I think I deserve? I told you it's gonna be challenging this morning. Years ago, when I was a young adults pastor, I remember talking with someone who was upset about still being single, and the reason he said it was so difficult was because God had blessed so many of his friends with these great relationships and marriages, and he said it was just so unfair. Now, I didn't get married until I was 38 years old, so I was a single adult for a long time, so I felt like I had a bit of expert on the subject. So I said, hey, let's just put your friends aside for a moment, and let's think about a different question. Here's the question. What has God entrusted to you right now? And he thought for a moment. He said, well, I have some extra time on my hands, and I'm pretty good at, leading and getting stuff done. And I said, okay, well, what do you think God would want you to do with that if he were you? I was laying on the pastor talk like really thick at this point, like really giving it to him. I said, well, I think God would probably want me to use that time to invest in other people or pour into something that matters. And I said, yeah, I think you're onto something. And by the way, remember this, Jesus was single and Paul was single. There's nothing wrong with being single. And so he started using that extra time to serve as a leader in the church. And guess what happened along the way? He met someone, they started dating. It was like obnoxiously cute, kind of annoyed everybody. But anyway, more importantly, he started to flourish personally in a way he hadn't before. He started to experience a kind of joy, humility, became more patient and loving, all just by pushing back on that spirit of entitlement. Here's my point. We have to stop focusing on trying to make life even because on what we think we're entitled to, and start focusing on taking responsibility for what God has given us based on what we've been entrusted with. I'm gonna say that again. We have to stop focusing on trying to make life even based on what we think we're entitled to, and start taking responsibility for what God has already given us based on what we've been entrusted with. Which takes us right back to Jesus' story. Look at verse 19. Jesus goes on to say, after a long time, the master of those servants returned and settled accounts with them. The man who received 5 bags of gold brought the other 5. Master, he said, you entrusted me with 5 bags of gold. See, I have gained 5 more. And his master replied, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share in your master's happiness. The man with 2 bags of gold also came. Master, he said, you entrusted me with 2 bags of gold. See, I have gained 2 more. And his master replied, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful with a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share in your master's happiness. Anybody notice that God's response is exactly the same to both of these servants? He's not like, well, the other guy made 5. Why didn't you make 5? Same response to both servants. Now, this is really, really important. It raises a really important spiritual principle that I want to point out. The fact that he repeats the same words to servant 1 and servant 2 means you are only accountable for what God has entrusted to you. And I want everybody just to exhale. Okay. You're not accountable for some life you haven't been given or some resources you don't have or some opportunity that hasn't been presented to you. You are only accountable for what God has entrusted to you. God understands that life isn't even. He knows we're born into different situations which lead to different experiences and opportunities, and so you're only accountable for what God has entrusted to you, that relationship you're actually in, the education or career you actually have, the kids you're raising, the resources you have, whether it's a lot or a little, we are only responsible for what God has entrusted to us. But, and here's the hard news, there's a part 2 of that statement, you are also fully accountable for what God has entrusted to you. Servant 1 wasn't accountable for what servant 2 did with his money, but he was fully accountable for what he did with his own money. Servant 2, same thing. We are only accountable for what God has entrusted to us, and we are fully accountable for what God has entrusted to us. Why does this matter? Because there will be a day when the true owner of all of our stuff comes back, and he won't just ask you, did you go to church every week? Or did you read your Bible every week? Or did you join a small group? He's going to say, I entrusted you with a marriage. What did you do with it? He's going to say, I entrusted you with leadership skills. What did you do with them? He's going to say, I entrusted you with artistic talent. What did you do with it? He's going to say, I entrusted you with financial wealth or resources. What did you do with it? Here's my question to you. Have you ever thought about what you're going to say in response? I told you, it's going to be a challenging morning. Brings us to the third servant. This is in verse 24. Then the master who had received 1 bag of gold came, or the man who had received 1 bag of gold came. Master, he said, I knew that you are a hard man, harvesting where you have not sown and gathering where you have not scattered seed. So I was afraid and went out and hid your gold in the ground. See, here it is. Here is what belongs to you. Now, we can't go back in time and hear the tone in which Jesus uttered these words, but it's clear that this third servant is holding God accountable for his own choices. He's basically saying, I wouldn't have done this if you weren't such a demanding and greedy and stingy person. In other words, I did what I did because of who I think you are. And then the master replied, and this gets pretty serious. His master replied, you wicked, lazy servant. So you knew that I harvest where I have not sown and gather where I have not scattered seed. Well, then you should have put my money on deposit with the banker so that when I returned, I would have received it back with interest. So take the bag of gold from him and give it to the one who has 10 bags. Whoever has will be given more, and they will have an abundance. Whoever does not have, even what they have will be taken from them. And now throw that worthless servant out into the darkness where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Told you, it's a challenging story. Now, just to be clear, this doesn't mean that if you've ever been lazy or selfish, God's just going to throw you off into hell. But The severity of this conclusion is meant to wake us up to the fact that so often in life, we're living just like servant number 3. We feel entitled to what we want. We feel wronged by what looks uneven. And the result is we get lazy and irresponsible, even if we're not really aware of it. We start to think things like, because I'm not rich, I'll just mismanage my money. It doesn't really matter how I use it. I don't have enough anyway, it doesn't matter. Or because I don't have a relationship or marriage I don't have the relationship or marriage I want, I'll just be reckless with my sexuality. Or because I never get that promotion I deserve, I'll just be lazy or unethical in my work. All the while blaming God for being stingy or mean or hard because we think we're entitled to something better. To which Jesus would respond, God is not accountable to you to make your life even. God is not accountable to you or to me to make our lives even. You are accountable to God to use the life, the body, the skills, the time, the resources, the gifts that you have been given. And he doesn't take lightly what he's entrusted to you. That's why the severity of the story is what it is. God is not just saying, sure you have some money or sure you have the gifts, but don't worry about it. You don't have as much as that person, so it's okay if you waste it. God sees your bag of gold, however large, however small, whether 1, 2, 5, or 10, as nothing short of an opportunity to make an eternal difference in this world. That's how he sees it. Everything he's entrusted to you, God sees as having eternal potential. And in fact, it's in seasons when we think we lack so much that God can actually use us the most. I've experienced this personally in my life. After I got out of college, I basically failed at my first job. I ended up doing some odd jobs through a temp agency, like answering phones, which I was terrible at. I could barely pay my rent, while so many of my friends had great jobs and were moving forward in their great careers. And I remember thinking, I've really messed up my life, and it's not fair, and God's never gonna be able to use me. And that's when I started volunteering at a college ministry that was just at a church down the road, because if there's one thing I had, it was some extra time. And so I gave God my time. That was my one bag of gold in that moment. And what's so amazing is I didn't just discover my call to ministry in that season, which has changed my life entirely. I got to experience firsthand the power of God to change lives. It was one of the sweetest seasons of my life that I will never forget. Why? Because instead of having a short-sighted, comfort-driven, life owes me posture, I just said, God, here's the little bag of gold I got. I want to use it. God, take it, use it, multiply it, do something with it. And that's my challenge for you today and for us as a church this year, to make 2024 better than 2023. It's not about having the perfect list of resolutions for this year. It's about this one simple thing. It's about taking responsibility for what God has entrusted to you. That's your resolution. That's 2024. Whether it's 5 bags, 2 bags, or 1, you're not entitled to it. You've been entrusted with it. And it could be anything. It could be spiritual, the spiritual gifts God's given you, relational, a relationship that you could pour or invest in somebody else. It could be financial, what you're doing with your resources. It could be physical, like the skills, the time, the wisdom, whatever you have. Just whatever God's given you, how can you take responsibility for what you have today? And by the way, if you're curious about where you need to start, just think for a moment about that one part of your life where you've been avoiding taking responsibility. See, I think the problem isn't that we don't know where we need to step up. The problem is we're often just too lazy or selfish to do it. But God is calling each and every one of us to take responsibility for what he has entrusted to us. And to do that, there's one more thing you need to remember, and it's simply this. Remember that God is always generous. This is really the good news of this hard story. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who did what? First line of the story, entrusted his wealth to you, and you, and you, and you, and you, and you. The God of the Bible is not about a God who takes for himself what he deserves. It's a God who gives us what we don't deserve. life, joy, relationship, meaning, love, even grace for all the mistakes we've made. You see, the third servant in the story did what he did because he had the wrong picture of God. Master, I knew you were what? A hard man, he said. Pretty shocking words about someone who's been so generous with his own wealth. But friends, isn't that how we often think about God? Hard, stingy, selfish, mean. You see, the choices we make in our lives don't just reveal our character, they reveal what we think about God's character. Is he good? Will he provide? Will he walk with me through this challenge or obstacle? But the real tragedy of the story is not just that the third servant missed out in his own life. It's also that he robbed every person he met the opportunity to see how God could use that bag of gold that he buried in the ground. Why? Because he took God's investment in him and decided it was too small to make any difference or too insignificant for God to use it. And friends, we do this all the time, don't we? God can't use me, I'm just a stay-at-home mom. God can't use me, I'm just a blue-collar guy. God can't use me, I'm just getting by financially. God can't use me, it's just me. See, I wonder, maybe underneath all that entitlement stuff that can be so off-putting and all that stuff, maybe it's just fear and insecurity because we've forgotten how generous and gracious the Master really is. So here's how I want to close today. We're going to take some time to pray, but not as we normally do. I'm going to ask you if you're able to stand. So if you're able, just go ahead and stand up. And a lot of our prayers start with these three words, or my prayers will start with these three words: God, give me. And then I list out all the things that I need, or I think I deserve. But what my prayers rarely start with is God, take my gifts, take my time, take my resources, take what little I feel like I've got to give today and use it and bless it and multiply it. And so what I want to invite you to do is just to close your eyes for just a moment. And before we sing this last song and go on about our New Year's Eve, I just want to invite you to stand in a posture that is free from entitlement. Whether that means your hands are open or your insides aren't clinging to what you feel you've got to do or what you think you deserve or what you don't have, or just enter a space internally and even externally if you want, where you're free from entitlement. You don't have to deserve anything. This is not about what you deserve. And we're going to together take a moment and just offer our prayers, starting with God, take my. So what's God entrusted to you that you can offer back to him right now? God, take my time this week. God, take my gifts, these strengths that I use to earn money or make a difference or gain popularity. God, take my work. God, take my resources. God, take my dreams about the future. Ooh, those are precious, aren't they? I just want to challenge you right now in the quiet of your heart, pick one thing that you can entrust to God, that you can say, God, I'm going to use this. I'm not going to cling to it. I don't deserve it, but I'm going to make the most of it this year. Jesus, I'm just so grateful that you are so generous, that the underlining of this seemingly hard story and challenging story is the reminder that you've entrusted us right now with so much, more than we could ask for, more than we could ever need. You've already given, and you promise to give even more if we trust you. So God, take what we have, use what we have, bless what we have. You are worthy of all of it as we worship you today and over this next year. And we pray this in your name, and everybody said, amen.